Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hi guys. Let's learn. The original link to the video, top of the description. What do we have? Could Trump be good for the EU? Interesting. Preemptive like. I think if you're from a NATO perspective or like a security perspective or an EU or economic perspective, I could see your argument that a more like isolationist president could, well, I guess you could say he's less isolationist in some ways, could make it so in the long run that European countries and the EU could become just more independent on the USA, and in the long run less dependence on some other country is a good thing. So maybe that's part of the argument here. I don't know. Let's learn, guys. My name's Connor. If you're new, have I said everything? TLDR News EU. Great intro. Let's go.
Brought to you by Ground News. On Wednesday, Donald Trump was declared the winner of the US presidential election. Now, American elections always matter for Europe, but this one especially so, given the stark differences in Harris and Trump's attitudes towards the EU, Ukraine, and NATO. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how Trump's policies will affect Europe, how Europe might respond to a second Trump term, and whether this is the beginning of the end for the transatlantic alliance.
I doubt that on the last
Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Broadly speaking, the two policy areas from a new Trump administration that would most directly affect Europe are Trump's foreign policy and his tariff-centric economic policy. Let's start with his foreign policy, though. From Europe's perspective, the most important foreign policy issue at stake is obviously Ukraine, and the question of NATO more widely. So what actually is Trump's Ukraine policy? Well, it mainly seems to revolve around ending the war as fast as possible. On multiple occasions, Trump has claimed that he'll negotiate a deal between Russia and Ukraine almost immediately upon taking office, or even before he's actually assumed presidency. More recently, Trump claimed on the Lex Friedman podcast that he had, quote, a very exacting plan on how to stop Ukraine and Russia, but that he couldn't talk about the plan because if he did, then they wouldn't be a surprise. This has
Sure, maybe, but also he could just not have a plan yet and is just saying that.
Surprisingly provoked some anxiety in Kyiv and other European capitals, because Ukraine worries that any deal agreed right now would benefit Russia, or at least fall short of Ukraine's maximalist war aims, which include recapturing all of its pre-2014 territory. Although
the problem here for me, guys,
war aims,
I am no foreign policy expert,
which include recapturing,
if you see me before, I assume you already knew. But if there is a deal struck where, like, okay, Russia, you can keep this territory. This is now Russian. Crimea, it's just Donbass and all this area. Okay, you can keep it. It should either be that, but Ukraine then gets into NATO. Because if you just give this to Russia and then also agree Ukraine also won't join NATO, then that's just a win-win-win for Putin. Then it's like, okay, sure, and then I'll just attack later maybe. So if it's like, you get to keep this, well, then, if you want that, then I'm not even saying this would still be a good deal. I'm just saying if you don't even do this, it's ridiculous. But this Ukraine now goes into NATO right away. If Russia says no to that, then like there's no deal. There should be no deal. There's no way you should get this and Ukraine not get in NATO, because you're just going to attack again. So it should either be, okay, we're just going to continue supplying more and more and more and more to Ukraine and giving them more capabilities. So that's the thing. That would be the most infuriating thing ever. I don't think Ukraine, if the U.S., it's like, put it in your own country. Like, Mexico conquers Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, right? Or like California, New Mexico, Arizona. And then someone coming up and just being like, okay, just give that to them, all right? That would be insane, not negotiable, no way, all right? But I'm saying, like, in reality, the options, I feel like that would be the only two answers right now if you were to have a stop the war. It's, okay, you keep all of this, but Ukraine is now in NATO, or no deal. You know what I mean?
Bring all of its pre-2014 territory, although we should say that this currently looks very unlikely to happen anytime soon regardless. These anxieties were exacerbated by an interview that J.D. Vance gave to the Sean Ryan show in September, where he talked about a demilitarized zone along the current front lines, and said that Ukraine would end up as a neutral state rather than joining NATO, despite
No, not a neutral state.
the fact that NATO has already started Ukraine's membership process, and Ukraine has made it clear that it feels that NATO membership is the only effective way.
I'm sorry, that is so stupid.
Current front lines.
That's exactly what I said would be the worst scenario, is saying, okay, you can have this land you conquered, stop the fighting, and we still won't have Ukraine in NATO. That is such a good deal for Putin. And what did you gain?
And said that Ukraine would end up as a neutral state rather than joining
ridiculous.
NATO, despite the fact that NATO has already started Ukraine's membership process, and Ukraine has made it clear that it feels that NATO membership is the only effective way of guaranteeing against future Russian aggression. Nonetheless, even if it's suboptimal from Kyiv's perspective, Trump will probably be able to force Ukraine to agree to a deal by threatening to withhold much-needed military aid, as he did in his first term. That is, assuming that the rest of NATO doesn't massively step up to fill the void left by the US, or Ukraine decides to fight on anyway.
This is my problem with that approach, is that I don't see helping Ukraine as a favor. Like, Ukraine is fighting America's main adversary. I guess you could say China is also a main adversary, but Russia as a main adversary, and you're just going to let them have it? So for me, I see that any aid to Ukraine is our benefit, in that Ukraine's people fight the war against one of our adversaries. And so it's not charity. And so doing anything where you would withdraw or like want payment back for this stuff, you're acting like the U.S. is doing a favor for Ukraine rather than the U.S. using Ukraine as a weapon against Russia that they're already fighting well against. So
now, we should say that Trump's talk of a deal hasn't gone down well in Russia either, with Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov dismissing his claims of a quick deal as, quote, within the realm of fantasy. While Vance's proposed deal is arguably closer to Russia's ideal outcome than Ukraine's, given that it would mean Ukraine ending up as neutral, it still falls short of Putin's maximalist war aims, which include the total annexation of the 4 oblasts claimed by Russia in 2022: Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Russian forces currently don't control all of Donetsk, Kherson, or Zaporizhia, so a freeze along the current front lines would fall short of Putin's stated aims, especially if there's a sizable buffer zone. So if Russia does refuse Trump's rapid peace plan, which seems at least possible, it will be interesting to see how Trump responds. While many European and Ukrainian leaders worry that he'll just make concessions to Putin, it's worth noting that in a 2023 interview with Fox News, Trump said that he'd actually step up support to Ukraine to force Russia to acquiesce, saying, quote, "I'd tell Putin, if you don't make a deal, we're going to give them a lot, more than they ever got." When it comes to NATO more generally, though, Trump's policy basically seems to be a more extreme form of the policy he pursued in his first term, getting other NATO member states to pay more into the budget. Now, while a complete withdrawal from the alliance does seem unlikely, Trump's presence in the White House does arguably undermine Article 5, which guarantees that all NATO members will protect any other member that comes under attack, given that Trump has explicitly said that he won't protect NATO members who don't pay their way.
So his comments of saying if they don't pay their fair share, that he'll encourage Russia to invade, absolutely insane. And this is another weird thing for me, because if there is an agreement that if you're in NATO that we need to spread the spending, not like every country pays the same, just percentage of your GDP of your country's salary needs to go to NATO spending. I don't see how that should not be an obligation of every country, right? However, even if a country is like, no, I'm not paying the 2%, I'm going to pay 1.8, saying that you're going to get kicked out, I mean, that just leaves another country that can be manipulated by other powers. And so, on the one hand, of course, encouraging Russia is a stupid thing to do by countries who don't pay. On the other hand, it's like you should pay the 2% of your GDP. I mean, come on, please do that. So that's one of the things where I hope Trump is just kind of bluffing, but you never know.
But it's not all just about...
And again, the same as our aid to Ukraine, NATO countries, NATO benefits the United States a lot. And so I hope there's an understanding
policy,
there.
Because Trump's economic policy will also impact Europe.
Anything I'm saying that's wrong, guys, as always, please call me out on it, as well as any questions I have some answers.
About foreign policy, because Trump's economic policy will also impact Europe. Trump has again threatened to impose tariffs on the European Union, like he did in his first term. Although it's worth noting that the tariffs he did in fact impose ended up being less dramatic than his 2016 campaign rhetoric suggested. This time round, Trump has floated imposing a flat tariff on all goods coming into the US, running at either 10 or 20%, and told Bloomberg in an interview a couple of months ago that the EU is like China, presumably a reference to the fact that they both run large trade surpluses with the US. Research by LSE suggests that these tariffs would hurt the European economy, albeit far less than they'd hurt the Chinese or American economy. But some countries, especially those that export lots to the US, like Germany, would be hit worse than others. More worryingly, perhaps, in the long term, these tariffs could accelerate Europe's ongoing deindustrialization by encouraging manufacturing companies to move their factories to America so that they can sell products into the American market tariff-free. All in all, both Trump's economic and foreign policy will probably present serious challenges to Europe. Whether or not Trump's presidency ends up being good or bad for Europe, however, ultimately depends on how the continent responds to these challenges. Here, there's an optimistic take, a neutral take, and a pessimistic take available. The optimistic take, recently outlined in a controversial Politico piece by Mushtaba Rahman, is that a second Trump presidency would actually be good for Europe. A second Trump presidency could force the EU to cooperate more and take more dramatic action on issues of defense, security, and the economy, perhaps finally ending the continent's precarious reliance on its increasingly unpredictable transatlantic network.
The only problem I see here is that this seems to be more of a thing that should be done and negotiated when there aren't wars in the world, especially one on the European doorstep, or in Europe, with Ukraine and Russia. And so I think in the long term, it could help Europe get more freedom from having to rely on so much American military equipment for their own defensive infrastructure and defensive weapons. And so that could be a good thing in the long run. But I don't think it's the time for that sort of transition. And maybe that's a thing for when the war with Russia is over. Now, maybe when the war is over, there won't be as much of a push for that. So, it just seems like the positives that could come out of this stuff just shouldn't happen during a hot war.
Action on
Too
second
risky.
Trump presidency could force the EU to cooperate more and take more dramatic action on issues of defense, security, and the economy. Perhaps finally ending the continent's precarious reliance on its increasingly unpredictable transatlantic neighbor, something the French have wanted to do since de Gaulle. The more measured, neutral take is that the EU will respond to a second Trump presidency the way it did to the first one. Basically do damage control, try and avoid annoying Trump, and just hope that a more Atlanticist candidate succeeds him next time round.
Okay, well, big difference. There wasn't a war that time, right? When did the war break out exactly? Was it at the very beginning of Biden or at the very end of Trump? Well, most of the time, at least, if not all of Trump's first presidency, there weren't these wars going on. So it's a bit different, right?
As Biden did in 2020. Candidate succeeds him next time round, as Biden did in 2020. In this scenario, the EU doesn't really change. It sort of stumbles along, as it always does. But the pessimistic take is that Trump's return divides the EU. There's a contingent in European politics, think Viktor Orban, Geert Wilders, and Giorgia Meloni, who agree with much of Trump's politics. While the EU was able to put up a relatively united front during Trump's first term, this will be more difficult this time around, given the growing number of this more pro-Trump contingent. And this is why Trump's second term could end up further dividing an already divided EU. In fact, Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister and the current holder of the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union, warned about this exact issue ahead of time, saying that depending on the results of the US election, the EU might have to fundamentally change their approach to Russia, with 48 different news outlets reporting on this story alone. Now, 36% of that reporting came from the left, while 43% came from the right. And if you compare the headlines, you start to see some interesting framing emerge. On the left, you have the Kyiv Independent saying that if Trump wins the US presidential election, Europe cannot remain pro-war. While on the right, you have Arrigo simply saying, Viktor Orban, come on Donald Trump. Trump wins the US presidential election, Europe cannot remain pro-war.
Because of less assurance of US military backing?
While on the right, you have Arrigo simply saying, Viktor Orban, come on Donald Trump. These stories are similar. The framing, but that's very different.
I mean, this is just one statement. It's not really there's no really meat to it. It's a cheer. It's not a...
Trump. These stories are similar. The framing, but that's very different. Now, all of this analysis is possible thanks to our sponsor, Ground News.
So this is the end of the video. I'm going to watch through and just at least to get to the promo codes and links so you guys can see it if you're interested in getting Ground News. But very interesting video. I find politics, international affairs very interesting. Okay? And so sometimes I have a bit more hot-headed takes that sometimes don't portray my... that sometimes don't match my confidence and knowledge in those takes. So in these videos, especially my comments in these videos, if I say something that was just wrong or you disagree with or answer it, please point it out. I mean, that's how I learn. It's how you guys help me learn. And yeah, it's a great video. Would love to see any comments on this. And hopefully I'll see you guys next time. I'm going to get to the Ground News stuff. Great being able to... He kind of played a bit of an ad of what it was like right there. So I at least want to get to his promo codes. Please use them if you're getting it now. Give me your codes, brother. Make sure to use Ground News, ground.news/TLDR. It'll give you some savings on getting it if you're interested, and it helps out the people making the videos that you and me are watching right now. It's just the right thing to do, okay? Love y'all. See you guys next time. Look forward to comments. Try and be... I know this is a very hot topic, so try and be cordial or whatever. Please call me out. Love y'all. See you guys next time. Bye.